Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can people hear me? Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can people hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can people see my screen as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashwant, and today we'll look at previous year's week for assignment problems for the course Drug Delivery Principles and Engineering. Okay. So the first question reads, what is proton sponge effect? And two options are correct here. Is it particles? Is it the case that the particles carry secondary or tertiary amines which help in escaping endosomal and lysosomal vesicles inside the cells? Or the phenomenon which leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of the vesicles? Or particles act as sponges for electrons? And or is it the phenomenon where particles carrying positively charged moieties neutralize free radical moieties in an extracellular environment? Or is it the phenomenon of gaining positive charge during endosomal transport? Or is it just a sponge that soaks up all proteins in the vicinity? Or is it the phenomenon of gaining negative charge during endosomal transport? Okay, so they're asking us what proton sponge effect is, and if we remember very briefly what the proton sponge effect is basically, especially when you're delivering drugs to phagosomal and endosomal cells, right? So cells which have the ability to take up particles surrounding them. So think about cells like macrophages, dendritic cells, so on and so forth. So the way these cells take up these particles is either through phagocytosis, endocytosis, there is macropinocytosis, multiple ways, channel dependent transport and so on. But if a drug or a particle were to be taken up through phagocytosis or endocytosis, it'll end up in the endosomes and lysosomes, right? So initially in the endosomes, and then eventually it will be routed to the lysosomes. So, because of the fact that it's ending up in endosomes, it's not able to access any of the intracellular organelles or components, right? So this particle is contained within this endosome, and it's not able to, even if it releases drug, the drug will also be in the endosome itself. It will not reach any of the intracellular space. It cannot reach the nucleus. It cannot reach the mitochondria, or it cannot reach any of the enzymes that we might want to target that are outside the endosome. So for this, what we want to happen ideally is for this particle to be able to come out of this endosome. So even though a macrophage or a dendritic cell is phagocytosing your particle and it's ending up in the endosome, you want the particle to come out of this endosome and then release its drug, or come out of its endosome relatively faster. So for that, what we can employ is something called the proton sponge effect, which is essentially these particles that carry this secondary and tertiary amines. And essentially, what they do is they buffer the pH of the endosomes, basically cause a lot of osmotic swelling in the endosomes and a lot of water influx, so which will result in uh, essentially the vessels growing larger and larger and larger, eventually bursting. So the reason it's called proton sponge effect is because there is a lot of sudden influx of H plus ions as well as along. chloride ions, Cl minus ions, and as a result of which, along with the chloride ions, there's also water that enters into this membranes. So that's why you see this osmotic swelling and eventual bursting of the vesicles. Yeah, we've read about some of the polymers that are routinely used for this effect. So polyethylene imine, which is a tertiary amine. That's routinely used for this ability to escape the endosome. So if you put your drug inside polyethyl ethylenamine polymer, your drug will eventually escape the endosome and get released in the intracellular space. Yeah, so that's proton sponge effect. Uh, yeah, although the technology works very well in theory, the in practice we see maximum reported endosomal escape of around 10%. So you can imagine most of the particle is still in the endosome, but your goal is to ensure that enough comes out to release the drug in the intracellular space. So that's proton sponge effect. So which with that we'll go back to the question. So what is proton sponge effect? Uh, is it particles carrying secondary or tertiary amines which help in escaping endosomal and lysosomal vesicles inside the cell? Is it the phenomenon which leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of the vesicles? Uh, are they the particles that act as sponges for electrons? Is it a phenomenon where particles carrying positively charged moieties neutralize free radical moieties in an extracellular environment? Or is it the phenomenon of gaining positive charge during endosomal transport? Or is it a sponge that soaks up all protons in the vicinity? Or is it the phenomenon of gaining negative charge during endosomal transport? So, what do you guys think? Okay, so let's go through these options one by one. Uh, Yeah, so the phenomenon of gaining negative charge during endosomal transport. So this does not happen, right? So nowhere in this whole chain does a particle gain a negative charge. It's just the constitution of the particle because uh, it has a higher amount of secondary and tertiary amines. We observe this effect. So the particle itself is not changing its charge during this process, right? So obviously that's not true. A sponge soaks up all protons in the vicinity. So this is also not true. It's not simply soaking up all the protons in the vicinity. It's allowing more protons and water to uh, enter the endosome. The phenomenon of gaining positive charge during endosomal transport. So no, right? So the particle is not changing in its charge. The phenomenon where particles carrying positively charged moieties neutralize free radical moieties in an extracellular environment. We are not talking about extracellular space here, right? So we're talking completely intracellular environment. Whether it's in endosomes or lysosomes or outside of these endosomes and lysosomes, that's for further details. But initially, at least, we're not talking about extracellular environment. So that's wrong answer. Particles act as sponges for electrons. Not true. Uh, and phenomenon which leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of vesicles. Is this true? What do you guys think? So
Yes, sir.
yeah, yeah. So this is true. And particles carry secondary or tertiary amines which help in escaping endosomal and lysosomal vesicle synthesis. So that's true, right? So that's what proton sponge effect is. So yeah, so those two are the correct options. Okay, which one is not correct about dendrimers? They are tree-like polymers branching out from a central core and subdividing into hierarchical branching. They are generally not more than 100 nanometers in size. They have very dense surface surrounding a relatively hollow core. They have very high molecular weight. The entire structure can be divided into generations of shells. Branch density increases with each generation. The size of the dendrimer depends on the number of generations. They're generally more than 100 nanometers in size. Okay. So if you guys remember, so a dendrimer is essentially a branch structure of polymers in this case, but yeah. So it's a branch structure, right? So it starts somewhere over here and it starts branching. So as you can see, so each branch is a generation. So this is G1. So this entire circle that you are seeing here, that's G1. So generation one, wherein it's starting to branch out. And as these branches in turn start to branch out, that will become generation two. And as these branches further progress to branch out, that will become generation three. So those are generations. So the size, as you can notice, it's increasing as you increase the generations, right? Because it's keeping on constantly branching out and moving out. So the size will increase with increasing generations. And when we look at the density, so the density, if you observe carefully, is also increasing with increasing generations because initially it started off with one branch, but so generation one, let's count the number of branches, right? So one, two, three, four, five, six branches. But let's count the number of branches in generation 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 223. So whatever, a lot more branches than six branches that we see in generation 1, right? So, and you can see it's much more closely packed in generation 3 than in generation 1. So generation 1 has a lot of empty space. So all this is empty space. But generation 3 has very little of empty space because of so many branches being there. So as generations increase, not only is the size increasing, but the density is also increasing on the outer layer. But as you can see, most of the inner layer is relatively hollow. So the density is uh, increasing as you keep moving out, with the interior being mostly hollow and the exterior being mostly densely packed. So that's one more feature. And if you can see the periphery of the dendrimer, it's a lot of branch structures and you can load several things to it. So you can load enzymes, antibodies, targeting ligands, fluorescent trackers, PEG, drug molecules, nucleic acids. So many of these you can load onto these branching structures at the periphery. So it's a lot more packed and a lot more uh, dense at the periphery. So if you look at the features, so a dendrimer is a very well defined structure. It's a nano-sized molecule, highly symmetric in architecture. So you can nicely draw one line here, one line here. So it's very symmetric. It has external multifunctionality, interior cavity. So external multifunctionality in the sense you can load several things onto the periphery of this dendrimer, and it has the interior cavity. So a lot of empty space in the inside. Terminal grooves, branching units. But yeah, so if we go back to the question, they're asking which one is not correct about dendrimers. So they're tree-like polymers branching out from a central core and subdividing into hierarchical branching. Is this true?
Yes, sir.
It's true, right? Yeah. So that's true. They're generally not more than 100 nanometers in size. Is this true? Let's come back to this. So obviously one of these has to be wrong, but let's look at the other options. So very dense surface surrounding a relatively hollow core. That's true, right? So we've just discussed most of the interior is empty, so the core is hollow, but it's surrounded by a dense surface. So that's true. They have very high molecular weight, which is also true because they are constantly branching and very dense structures. The entire structure can be divided into generations of cells. So, sorry, if you see here, this structure can be divided into G1, G2, G3. So, generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, and branch density increases with each generation. That's true. We've just looked at that. And the size of the dendrimer depends on the number of generations. So we've seen both as the number of generations increase, the density increases as well as the size increases. Now let's go back to this. So they're generally more than 100 nanometers in size, or they're generally not more than 100 nanometers in size. So usually, even though they are nanometer structures, dendrimers are made to be over 100 nanometers in size. So you have multiple generations. So this would be the incorrect option, and they're generally more than 100 nanometers in size is the correct option. Yeah. And the reason they're generally more than 100 nanometers in size is because you would want so you would want to exploit several features of the dendrimer, right? So you would want to have the external have multifunctionality. So you would want to tag several things. You might want to include a very big enzyme, antibody, nucleic acid, whatever. So you'd want multiple access sites and a lot of free space on the periphery. So uh, you want it to have a lot of surface area. And even if you want to have just the drug, you would ideally want to have a lot of drug. So you'd want to have a lot of surface area. So generally they are larger than 100 nanometers. Okay. Okay, so ranking the order of clearance of charged molecules, pick the right one. Assume all particles are of the same size and below 6 nanometers, which means they can be successfully eliminated by the kidneys. And now they want us to rank the order of clearance of these charged molecules. So what goes out first and what goes out last? So negatively charged nanoparticles are cleared faster than neutral ones, followed by positively charged nanoparticles, owing mainly to interactions with GBM. Neutral particles are cleared fastest than positively charged ones, followed by negatively charged particles. Positively charged particles are cleared first, followed by negatively charged, and then neutral, or positively charged particles are cleared first, followed by neutral ones, and then negatively charged, or negatively charged particles are cleared faster, uh, followed by positively charged and then neutral, or neutral charged particles are cleared faster than negatively charged ones, followed by ultimately positively charged ones. Or none of the is it the case that none of the particles get cleared from the kidney because they're below 6 nanometers in size, or all the particles get cleared at the same rate, wherein the kidney does not have a charge based effect on particle clearance? Okay. So let's look at how kidney interacts with charge-based particles. Uh, yeah. So if a particle were weakly negative, remember. So this is a membrane, right? So most of it is made up of proteins, and it should be negatively charged. So if a particle is weakly negatively charged, even though there is some repulsion, it will eventually get cleared because it's only weakly negatively charged. Even though this entire layer is negatively charged, uh, and it might face some repulsion, it will take some time. So that's why you see this, and but it will ultimately get cleared. But if a particle is negatively charged, you see the amount of time it takes for the clearance is much higher because the entire GBM membrane is negatively charged. So the particle takes a lot more time to get cleared from the kidneys. So the circulation of the particle is a lot more. If it's neutral, it will take a moderate amount of time, but if it's positively charged, there is a lot of GBM attraction because this is negatively charged again, remember? So uh, if a particle is positively charged, there is a significant attraction towards crossing the GBM membrane, and as a result, the positively charged particles rapidly get cleared. So you see there is no squiggliness in this clearance. So it's just straight. So it will get attracted and it will get cleared rather quickly. So if we were to rate them, how would we rate them? So would it be first negative, neutral, positive, or positive, neutral, negative, or neutral, negative, positive? What do you guys think? Which will get cleared the fastest? Weakly negative, negative, neutral, or positive? Someone has message. Let me check that. Yeah, so positive. Yeah, so positive charged particles will get cleared the fastest, followed by neutral and then negative, right? So positively charged particles get cleared faster than neutral ones, followed by negatively charged particles, owing mainly to interactions with the GBM. Yeah, so that's the correct answer. Okay, moving on. Which one of the following is correct with regard to elasticity of particles? Stiffer particles can circulate for longer durations since they cannot be degraded easily. Uh, Low modulus particles can circulate longer as they can squeeze through tissues, avoiding uptake by immune cells. If the particles are highly elastic, they can escape phagocytosis irrespective of their size. Elasticity has no role in phagocytosis. Let me check if the person is admitted. Okay. Okay, so how does elasticity of a particle help in clearance, right? So, first of all, elasticity has been reported to have a profound effect in circulation times in blood. We all know RBCs. They circulate in blood for months, and that's because that's owing to their low elastic modulus. So for low modulus, larger particles were able to circulate in blood longer compared with smaller with their smaller counterparts. So what does it mean? So as the elastic modulus is going down, uh, the circulation time in blood is increasing, right? So first of all, elasticity has no role with respect to phagocytosis is not entirely true. What do you guys think could be the correct option? Is it the case that stiffer particles can circulate longer, or low modulus particles, or softer low modulus particles can circulate longer, or if the particles are highly elastic, they can escape phagocytosis irrespective of their size? What do you guys think? So if the modulus is higher, the particle is stiffer. And if the modulus is lower, the particle is softer. And I've just told you that RBCs circulate in blood for months because of their relatively low modulus of elasticity.
Second option, sir, right one.
Yeah, so low modulus particles can circulate longer because they can squeeze through several tissues and penetrations, right? So penetrations. So that's the correct option. Okay. Moving on, pegylation of nanoparticles is a common practice to evade uptake by phagocytic cells. Which one of the conformations of PEG is preferred to maximize this effect? Is it a brush conformation, a mushroom conformation, orientation does not matter, triangle orientation, circular orientation, or cubical orientation? So, if we briefly recall what the mushroom and brush conformations are, so the mushroom conformation is essentially this, wherein you have this big chain that's starting out as a thin chain, but it will create this huge mass immediately outside. Whereas the brush configuration is wherein you have single strands of peg that extend linearly, more or less linearly at the periphery of the particle, sort of creating this bristles of brush kind of shape. So what do you guys think will prevent the least amount of interaction with the particle? So as you can see, if we're talking about a protein interaction with the particle, so in mushroom configuration of peg chain, there are gaps between the mushrooms, and the mushrooms can move around, right? So the protein is eventually able to access the nanoparticle. But if it's a brush-like configuration, so this is much more robust because it's a bristle structure. These proteins have less and less chance of squeezing through and reaching the particle or nanoparticle or whatever it is. So the question is, pegylation of nanoparticles is a common practice to evade uptake by phagocytic cells. So in this case, we are talking about cells, not a protein. Uh, so the cell, remember, needs to will access the nanoparticle for it to successfully phagocytose it. So they're asking which conformation will prevent this. Is it a brush conformation or a mushroom conformation? Is it the case that orientation and conformations do not matter? Is it a triangle conformation? So triangle conformation would be something like this, right? So circular conformation would be so if this is nanoparticle, so if this is nanoparticle, circular conformation would be something like this, and cubical obviously will be something like this. So which conformation do you guys think would prevent the cells from interacting with the nanoparticle? Is it a brush conformation, a mushroom conformation, triangle conformation, circular, cubical, or is it the case that orientation does not matter? So the cell still needs to access the surface of this nanoparticle. If it's a mushroom conformation, the cell can. So this is, remember, a phagocytotic cell. So it can significantly modify its cytoskeleton, right? So it can become like this and interact with the nanoparticle. Obviously, it's not drawn to scale. The cell is much, much more bigger than the nanoparticle, but yeah, you get the idea. Or is it a brush conformation that prevents the most?
Brush configuration, sir.
Correct. Yeah. So the brush configuration prevents access to the nanoparticle, generally either by proteins or cells or whatever it is, right? So that's the best conformation to sort of prevent this phagocytosis. Okay. Which is the working principle behind? What is the working principle behind enhanced permeation and retention effect? Okay. Excessive nitrogen in the vicinity. Positive pressure between vasculature and intratumoral environment allows flow of particles from vasculature to tumor tissue. P53 mutation causes that protein to bind more tightly to the particles. Oncogenic mutation increases attention of cells to nanoparticles. Faulty lymphatic clearance of particles from intratumoral environment, or oncogenic mutation increases repulsion of cells to nanoparticles. What is the working principle behind EPR effect, or enhanced permeation and retention effect? So if we look at briefly recall what EPR effect is. So if it's a normal tissue, so these red balls are nanoparticles, let's assume, or blood for that matter, it doesn't matter. So as the blood is flowing in a normal tissue, there is some amount of particles that are leaking out because the blood vessels are not perfectly aligned. So your organs need blood. So the blood needs to come out of these vessels uh, throughout your body. So the blood vessels are leaky in nature. So the blood is coming out, and nanoparticles also come out to an extent. But if you have a tumor mass, so this entire region is tumor mass. What happens? So in a tumor mass, generally there is formation of new blood vessels because the mass is forming where it's not supposed to be. So it might not have blood vessel access, and it's growing, right? So as it's growing, the core will get less and less of blood. So it will secrete several factors such as VEGF and so on and so forth to promote this process called angiogenesis, or the formation of new blood vessels. So there is constant new blood vessel formation that's present in tumor environment, and this formation is very fast. So because it's so fast, these blood vessels. So if you look at the walls of the blood vessels, so these blood vessels are short, they're not properly formed, and there's a lot of gap between them compared to a normal tissue. So normal tissue, it takes a lot of time to form a new blood vessel, right? So it's perfectly formed, and there is enough leaky pathways for the blood to flow out, but not too much. But in case of tumor environment, microenvironment, it's forming at such a faster pace that these blood vessels are not properly formed, and they're not properly aligned. So there's a lot more leakage that can happen, right? So as a result, so if you can see pictorially as well, a lot of blood is being drained out. Be it blood or nanoparticles, a lot of it is being drained out. So this is enhanced permeation. Now, if you look at lymph flow, so the case reverses for lymph flow. So what happens during the formation of new lymphatic vessels is these lymphatic vessel walls are formed in a much more robust manner. So even much more robustly than normal what you would observe in a normal tissue. So normal tissue would have some leakage where whatever extracellular fluid is entering back inside this lymphatic vessel, right? But in tumor microenvironments, what happens is these gaps become much more smaller and much less frequent. So there is less leakage that happens. So in a normal lymph flow, so let's think of these red particles as nanoparticles. So you see a lot more nanoparticles are entering this lymph flow. Whereas even though the tumor has a lot more nanoparticles because of this enhanced permeation, very few of them are entering back into this lymph flow because of this very tiny lymphatic gaps that are present within the tumor microenvironment. So this is enhanced retention. So together, this is enhanced permeation in the first case and enhanced retention in the second case. So enhanced permeation and retention effect. Okay, so basically they're asking what is the working principle? Excessive nitrogen in the vicinity, positive pressure between vasculature and intratumoral environment allows flow of particles from vasculature to tumor tissue. P53 mutations cause the protein to bind more tightly to the particles. Oncogenic mutations increase attention of cells to nanoparticles. Faulty lymphatic clearance of particles from intratumoral environment. Or oncogenic mutations increase repulsion of cells to nanoparticles. What do you guys think? So obviously it has nothing to do, well, the entire process has something to do with mutations, but enhanced permeation and retention effect directly does not get affected by specific mutations in the cancer cells, right? So P53 mutation has nothing to do with it. Oncogenic mutation increases attention of cells to nanoparticles. This is not true. Nanoparticles in no way can recognize any oncogenic mutation, so they have no way of perceiving if a cell has more mutations or less mutations. Oncogenic mutation increases repulsion of cells to nanoparticles, which is again not true. Nanoparticles cannot recognize mutations. So, excessive nitrogen in the vicinity or positive pressure that causes leakage or faulty lymphatic clearance of particles from intratumoral environment. So, what do you guys think? Two options are correct here.
second and fifth.
Second and third. Okay. So this and this. Yeah, you're correct. So nitrogen has nothing to do with it. And yeah, so there's a lot of positive pressure, especially because the mass of cells is too high and the amount of extracellular fluid initially at least would be too low. So there's a lot of pressure to drive extracellular fluid out. So that's positive pressure, and the other option is faulty lymphatic clearance of particles from intratumoral environment. Yeah, so as we've discussed, the lymphatic clearance is quite slow and faulty. So that's the PRF. Okay, yeah. So moving on, which of the following methods can be used to measure size of nanoparticles? Two options are correct here. Is it X-ray diffraction, dynamic light scattering, atomic force microscopy, gene transduction, or bialistic gene gun mediated transfer? What do you guys think? What methods can be used to measure the size of nanoparticles? So we know one, right? Last week we looked at dynamic light scattering. So we know for sure that will help us measure the size of the nanoparticles. So the other one that can help us is atomic force microscopy, although not directly helpful. So atomic. Right. So what is dynamic light scattering, right? So basically you have a laser source and you have a lens that condenses this laser source into a very thin beam. And if you place your sample, obviously there is some amount of light that's scattered once the light beam hits the particles, so it will get scattered. And this amount of scattering, this theta, depends on the size of the particle, right? So if a particle is very small in size, the amount of scattering that it can do is, or the amount of deviation from the original path theta would be very low. But if a particle is big, the scattering will be very large. Uh, so, so this theta you can use to then, so you can record this theta, see how what's the theta or the angle of scattering for your particular sample, and then you can sort of measure the size of the particle. So that's dynamic light scattering. Atomic force microscopy is something that's completely different. So you have a cantilever or tip that's attached to a spring, and if you have a sample surface, what you can do is you can sort of move this tip on the surface, and based on how much it's moving, you can record that movement. So you can shine a laser on top of it and see both. Similar to this, the amount of scattering that's observed and also the path of the laser beam that can be measured. So this you can use to mostly measure the surface irregularities of a sample, but you can also use this to count the number of particles and the size of particles as well. So let's assume you have particles like this. So you can essentially you can essentially measure the surface area of the particle. So, or if you have a gold nanoparticle that's spherical, so you can measure half the surface area of your gold nanoparticle. So that will give you the size of the particle. So both dynamic light scattering and atomic force microscopy can be used to measure size of the nanoparticles. X-ray diffraction is usually the wavelengths of X-ray are quite large for them to able to successfully measure the size of nanoparticles, and gene transduction and bialistic gene mediated transfer are something that are completely different, right? So they're sort of techniques to introduce foreign genetic material into cells. So those are not correct options. Yeah, so dynamic light scattering and atomic force microscope. Okay. Which one of these is not an advantage of nano and microparticles? They're injectable, no need for, as a result, no need for surgical implantation. They can elicit inflammatory reactions in host. Uh, they're possible way for delivering large hydrophilic molecules inside cells. And particles can be adapted for targeted delivery to cells and tissues, and they improve the stability of drugs in vivo. So, which of the following is not an advantage? What do you guys think? Fairly straightforward question. So, a hydrophilic drug molecule will not readily cross the cell membrane, right? So, but if you want to deliver these inside cells, so they're saying nano and microparticles can be used. So, wherein you basically encapsulate your hydrophilic drug inside the nano and microparticles, and these microparticles can go into the cell through several different routes. So, so that's an advantage clearly, right? So otherwise you would not be able to deliver these hydrophilic molecules inside cells. So that's advantage. So in this case, wrong answer. Particles can be adapted for targeted delivery to cells and tissues. So this is also true, right? So if you have a particle, you can have several targeting or homing sequences that are present on top of this nanoparticle, which will help in targeted delivery. So that's also an advantage. they improve the stability of drug in vivo. So this is also true, right? So we've at least very initially seen how we can improve the half-lives of drugs by encapsulating them in nano and microparticles. So they can play a very profound role in improving the stability of the drug, both in terms of pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So uh, it can be simply improving the half-life of the drug, or it can be the case that you can now prevent the drug from being degraded or broken down by several enzymes or cells. So obviously that's also an advantage. So that's not a disadvantage. Here they're asking for a disadvantage. Uh, Injectable. So yeah, so because of their small size, they are obviously injectable. So you do not have to surgically implant them. They are not very big for surgery to happen because they're nano and microparticles. So obviously this is also an advantage, and they can elicit inflammatory reactions in host. Uh, First of all, do you guys think nanoparticles and microparticles can elicit inflammatory reactions in host? Can nanoparticles and microparticles elicit inflammatory reactions in host?
Yes.
Yeah, so uh, they can activate several pathways. They can, in fact, also activate complex pathway, complement activation system, and so on and so forth, right? So they can elicit inflammatory reactions in host, and obviously that's not an advantage. That's a disadvantage. And they're asking which of these is not an advantage. So eliciting inflammatory reactions in host is, in most cases, not an advantage. Yeah. Okay. So which one of the following parameters does not affect microparticle synthesis using double emulsion method? So, uh, polymer type and molecular weight do not affect microparticle synthesis using double emulsion method, or polymer concentration in the oil phase, or organic solvent used in polymer solubility, the type and amount of surfactant in external phase, internal aqueous phase, organic solvent ratio, rate of stirring and type of mechanical force, or none of the above? Is it the case that uh, all of them affect the microparticle synthesis using the double emission method? So none of the answers are correct. So they're asking which of the following parameters does not affect microparticle synthesis using double emission method. So very briefly about double evaluation method. So I'll not talk much, but this is a water in oil in water double emission process wherein you have this aqueous drug solution with or without excipients that you pour into PLGA solvent, which is oil phase, and so that's that. Then you can pour this solution into an aqueous phase, which is polyvinyl alcohol. Polyvinyl alcohol will evaporate, leaving you with your uh, microparticles, which are basically oil phase that contain your aqueous phase drug. So your aqueous phase drug is inside, and it's surrounded by this oil phase PLGA or whatever it is, right? So that's the double emission process, and they're asking what are the factors that do not affect this process. Can anyone tell me? Do polymer type and molecular weight influence microparticle synthesis in this process?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, so they do. What about polymer concentration in the oil phase?
Yes, sure, sir.
Yeah. Organic solvent used in polymer solubility?
Also, sir.
Yeah, they also affect microparticle synthesis. Type and amount of surfactant in the external phase.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Internal aqueous phase or organic solvent ratio.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Rate of stirring and type of mechanical force.
Sure. It is also
Yeah, so this also affects. So the most likely answer is none of these
important.
factors do not play a role. So all of them play a very huge role in microparticle synthesis. Yeah, so these are the parameters that affect particle size and as well as particle formation during single or double emission methods. So polymer type and molecular weight, concentration in the oil phase, type of drug, method of incorporation, organic solvent used, and polymer solubility, type and amount of surfactant in the external phase, internal aqueous phase to organic solvent ratio, rate of stirring and type of mechanical force, evaporation rate, temperature, pressure, extraction rate. So all of these play a very big role in microparticle synthesis using emulsion-based methods. So yeah, none of the above. Okay, so moving on, we have a numerical question. So I think final question. So a core shell type nanoparticle is synthesized. The radius of the core is 2 nanometers, whereas that of the whole particle is 5 nanometers. What is the ratio of volumes of core to shell? Does anyone know how to solve this?
I
So,
think it's 8 is to 125, sir.
okay, so let's try to solve this. So basically they're saying it's a core shell nanoparticle, right? So what? Yeah. Okay. I don't have the answer, so we'll solve it and we'll see what the answer is. So this would be a core shell nanoparticle. So basically, this is hollow, and this is the ring. So what they're saying is, let me make this white. So this is a core shell nanoparticle. Okay. So now what they're saying is, I can draw. Yeah. So what they're saying is the radius of the core is 2 nanometers. So this is 2 nanometers. And whereas that of the whole particle is 5 nanometers. So this is 5 nanometers. What is the ratio of volumes of core to shell? So they're asking for the ratio of volume of core to shell. Shell is basically this, not the entire particle, only the shell. So this ratio to this ratio is what they're asking. So the way we solve this is basically, so we know volume of sphere 4 by 3 pi r cube, right? R cube. So we know volume of core because they've given the radius, which is 4 by 3 pi uh, 2 cube to the power 3. Now we know volume of whole particle is basically 4 by 3. Radius of the whole particle is 5. So 5 cube. Now what they're asking is volume of a ratio of volumes of uh, core to shell. So volume of core we already know. So that's just this. Now what is the volume of shell? Volume of shell is basically volume of shell is equal to volume of whole particle minus volume of core. So this minus this will give you the volume of this orange region. So this is minus, right? Is that correct? So if you bring out 4 by 3 pi, you'll have 8 divided by 5 pi is 25 pi is 125 minus 8. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that will be your ratio of volumes of core to the shell. But basically, yeah. So shell in this case is basically the orange part, and core is the white part, and the whole particle is white plus orange. Okay. So I think that's all I have today for week 4 questions. Do you guys have any doubts or any questions in general? Stop sharing my
Sir,
screen.
can you repeat first 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, I'll repeat. So this question,
Yes, sir.
yeah, okay. So basically what they're asking is what proton sponge effect is. So a proton sponge effect, whether it is particles carrying secondary or tertiary amines, which help in escaping endosomal and lysosomal vesicles inside the cell, or is it the phenomenon which leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of the vesicles, or it's the particles that act as sponges for electrons, or the phenomenon where particles carrying positively charged moieties neutralize free radical moieties in an extracellular environment? Or is it the phenomenon of gaining positive charge during endosomal transport, or it's a sponge that soaks up all protons in the vicinity, or the phenomenon of gaining negative charge during endosomal transport? So we've looked at what proton sponge effect is. Essentially, what it is so when you're trying to do intracellular delivery, especially to a phagocytic or endocytic cells, what ends up happening is whatever particle you're trying to deliver gets phagocytosed or endocytosed by the cell, and it'll end up in the endosome. So this endosome, and it's not able to access the intercellular environment. So if you want to target an enzyme that's present in the nucleus or mitochondria, this particle, even though it's releasing the drug is mostly present in the endosome, right? So it's not coming out because it's encapsulated within the endosome. So it has no way of reaching this nucleus or mitochondria. So what you want to happen is your particle should come out of this endosome as soon as it enters the cell. So how do you do that? So there is a phenomenon called proton sponge effect, wherein if you increase the secondary and tertiary amines of your uh, particle, so basically give it a lot of charge, what ends up happening is the pH of the endosomes gets buffered, and it needs to go back up, so or down, acidic. So there's a lot of proton influx through endosomal proton pumps, which is followed by chloride ion transport. All of this leads to a lot of water also getting into the endosome. So this will cause the endosomes to swell up, osmotic swelling, and eventually bursting of the vesicles. So we've discussed polyethylenamine to be a widely used polymer to get this effect. And we've also talked about how even though this effect is very good in theory, in practice, the maximum reported efficacy is around 10%. So that's proton sponge effect. Now, what they're asking is basically that what is proton sponge effect? Is it particles carrying tertiary and secondary and tertiary amines, which helps in escaping endosomal and lysosomal vesicles inside the cells? So that's true, right? This effect gets initiated only when there are secondary and tertiary amines to buffer the pH of the endosome. This phenomenon also leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of the vesicles, which is also true. So, it is not the case that particles are acting as sponges for electrons, because they cannot act as sponges. I mean, they can, but that's not what's happening here. Uh, it's not the phenomenon where particles carrying positively charged moieties neutralize free radical moieties in extracellular environment. So we're not talking about extracellular environment, we're talking about intracellular delivery. So that's not true. And it's also not the phenomenon of gaining positive charge during endosomal transport. So the charge of the particle is not getting significantly altered during this process. And it's also not a sponge that soaks up all protons in the vicinity. Although mechanistically it is what is probably happening, but it's not a sponge that soaks up protons in the vicinity, and also it's not the phenomenon of gaining negative charge during endosomal transport. So the correct answers seem to be particles that carry secondary or tertiary amines, which help in escaping endosomal, lysosomal vesicles inside the cells, and phenomenon which leads to osmotic swelling and bursting of vesicles. So yeah, so that's first question, and the second question is which one is not correct about dendrimers? They are tree-like polymers branching out from a central core and subdividing into hierarchical branching. They are generally not more than 100 nanometers in size, very dense surface surrounding a relatively hollow core. They have very high molecular weight. The entire structure can be divided into generations of cells. Branch density increases with each generation. The size of dendrimer depends on the number of generations, and they're generally more than 100 nanometers in size. So if we look at the general structure of a dendrimer, what a dendrimer is essentially a simple polymeric structure that branches out. So as you can see, it's branching out. And the more it branches out, so the very first time it branches out, it's called generation 1, G1. So this white circle is G1. And the second branching event happens, it's called G2. And the third branching event happens, it's called G3, and so on and so forth. And one of the key things that we can notice from the structure here is there's a lot of empty space in G1, right? So there's a lot of empty space in G1 with minimum branching. So the density is quite low and there is a lot of empty space. As you move to G2, this empty space decreases. Even though it's there, there is a lot more branching that's involved and the empty space decreases. So the density is increasing, the empty space is decreasing. If you move to G3, this empty space decreases further. So there is less and less empty space as you go up the generations, but the density keeps on increasing as you go up the generations. And there are several key features of dendrimers. So they're very well defined structures, nano-sized molecules. They're highly symmetric in architecture. So bilateral symmetry, quadrilateral symmetry. So they're very highly symmetric. So this is also a line of symmetry. This is also a plane of symmetry, so on and so forth. And they have external multifunctionality. So if you look at the very periphery of the dendrimer, so you can tag several things to it. You can tag antibodies, enzymes, targeting ligands, fluorescent trackers, peg chains, drug molecules, nucleic acids. You can have multiple of these in combination with each other, so on and so forth. And sorry, they also have interior cavity. So as I was discussing, there's a lot of empty space in the first generation. So their interior cavity is hollow, but as they go out, they become more and more densely packed, and as a result, not very hollow. So basically, what they're asking is which of the following is not correct about dendrimers? So they are tree-like polymers branching out from a central core and subdividing into hierarchical branching, as we have seen. Uh, they're generally not more than 100 nanometers, or they're generally more than 100 nanometers. So we'll come back to both of these questions later. But are they very dense? Do they have a very dense surface surrounding a relatively hollow core? This is true, right? So the G1 has a lot of empty space compared to G3. So, and the G1 is much more inside compared to G3. The G3 is outside. So this core is hollow, whereas the surface is dense. They have very high molecular weight, which is also true because of this heavy branching. The entire structure can be divided into generations of cells, which is true. So we saw G1, G2, G3, it can go on till G5, G6, G7, whatever. And the branch density increases with each generation. That's also true, right? So we've seen the density also keep on increasing with generation and generation. So compared to G1, the density at G2 is higher, and compared to G2, the density at G3 is higher. And the size of the dendrimer depends on the number of generations. That's also true, right? So as we have seen, as the generations increase, the size of the dendrimer also increases because it's branching more and more out. So it's sort of exploding like a bomb, but outside. Yeah. Now, so they're generally not more than 100 nanometers in size, or they're generally more than 100 nanometers is in size is the question. So usually dendrimers are built in such a way that they are generally greater than 100 nanometers in size, especially because uh, if you want to have this external multifunctionality, they need to have a very large surface area, and you would want to have a very large surface area because you're not most probably encapsulating your drug, you're attaching your drug at the periphery. So if you want to do that, you would want to have as much drug as possible, right? So generally they are constructed to be greater than 100 nanometers, which is uh, obviously not, so generally not more than 100 nanometers in size is a false statement about dendrimers. Yeah, so do you want me to go through the third question as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So here essentially what they're asking us to do is they're asking us to rank the order of clearance of charged molecules, basically based on their elimination from kidney, and they're asking us to pick the right one. They're asking us to assume all particles are of same size and below 6 nanometers. So essentially what they're asking us is which charged particle gets eliminated first and which gets eliminated last. So, is it negative, neutral, positive, uh, neutral, positive, negative, or positive, negative, neutral, or positive, neutral, negative, or negative, positive, neutral, or neutral, negative, positive, or is it the case that none of the particles get cleared from kidney because they're below 6 nanometers, or all the particles get cleared at the same rate because the kidney GBM membrane has no preference for charged particles. So essentially, they're asking us to pick the correct one. So is it the case that negatively charged particles get eliminated the fastest, followed by neutral, and then at last the positively charged particles get slowly eliminated, or uh, one of the several scenarios? So if we look at the interactions of charged particles with the GBM, so the GBM is essentially like all cell membranes negatively charged, right? So this entire region is negatively charged. If a particle is weakly negative, it might face some repulsion, but because it is weakly negative, it will take some time, but it will get eliminated from the kidney. So that's represented by this squiggly line. If a particle is very negative, there is significant GBM repulsion that happens, and the particle might take a lot more time to get eliminated. And if you see here, two particles, two of them are getting eliminated, even though they're taking some time. So weakly negative particles, most of them get eliminated, even though they take a long time. But negative particles, even though they are a lot more in circulation, they take a lot more time to get eliminated, and very few of them get eliminated. So they keep staying in circulation because of this GBM repulsion. Whereas neutral particles more or less get eliminated, they might take some time. They do not interact with GBM in a charge specific manner. They might have other interactions, but they take some time, and more or less they get eliminated without a problem. Whereas positively charged particles, because the GBM is negatively charged, they have significant attractions towards GBM, as a result of which they're rapidly eliminated from the body. So if you look at the arrows, the positively charged particles are straight away getting eliminated. Neutral particles take some time but get eliminated. Negatively charged particles take significantly larger amount of time. And weakly negative particles do take a lot more time than neutral particles, but not as much as negatively charged particles. So essentially, they were asking us in the question which particles get eliminated the fastest. So positive charged particles get eliminated the fastest, followed by neutral, followed by negative. So yeah, so positively charged nanoparticles are cleared faster than neutral ones, followed by negatively charged particles, owing mainly to their interactions with the GBM. That's any questions?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Uh, Does anyone else have any other question? Hi Ritesh, I think we're just about ending the session. So the session starts at 3 o'clock, by the way. So we'll wait for some time, but it starts at 3 o'clock. So since these are relatively shorter questions, the sessions tend to get over in 1.5 hours. Anyways, so yeah, so if you guys have no other question, we can end the meeting here. See you guys next week. Have a lovely weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Hey Darshan, I think we are just about to end this session because we're done discussing the questions. So the session starts at 3 o'clock. So maybe you might want to join a little bit faster for the next session. Okay, thank you.